Okay, welcome back everybody. For this session, we are so honored to have Mr. Nicolas Kent and Mr. Hans-Werner Kroesinger to share with us their thoughts. And as in the last session, after both of them have given their speeches, I'll open the floor. And I forget to mention that if you have any question and you want to ask in Cantonese or Mandarin, I will try my best to do the translation for them. Okay, so please don't be afraid to ask questions. I think they are very nice guys and they really welcome questions. Yeah, and so now I think that to start, I would like to invite Mr. Nicolas Kent to talk about his topic is an instrument of social change. And I would say, in fact, every time in this recent year, every time when I had a chance to go to London, classical theatre is one of the theatre that I always look upon to check whether there are any shows going on, because it's really my cup of tea. And so I really like to hear what Mr. Kent will say. So please.
Thank you very much. I'm incredibly excited to be here. I think this is a really important subject, and it's wonderful to see such a young audience here, a new generation who are excited about documentary theatre. I'm going to speak very personally about my journey, how I got excited about documentary theatre, and how I've always believed that theatre can be an instrument of change. At best, it gives us the gift of celebrating each other's different cultures, beliefs, ages, sex, and it teaches us new truths about life and questions old beliefs. And finally, it's a communal experience that through empathy between actors and audience binds us together by educating and entertaining us both emotionally and intellectually. The first evidence we in the West have of spaces which plays were performed goes back well over 2,000 years. This dialogue between the stage and the audience in the Greek theatre reflected the concerns of its society, satirized its politicians, debated the way society was governed, and most importantly, empathized with its citizens' concerns and the psychology of the individual. The best of theatre still does that. For me, it makes us laugh, it makes us cry, it entertains us, it informs us, and often teaches us new truths. And sometimes it makes us angry and spurs us into action, and it makes change. And that's the sort of theatre I want to talk about. I'm going to digress for a moment and show you what I mean and an example of the work I do. After President Trump's election in America last year, I telephoned the Public Theatre in New York and suggested I made a play from the Senate nomination hearings for his cabinet. The idea came because I, like many other people, was very curious about the people he would choose for his cabinet and the policy direction that his presidency would take. The Public Theatre quickly agreed to go ahead on this project, and a month before any of the hearings had taken place, they had already contracted me. The first hearing was on the 20th of January, and by the 14th of February, St. Valentine's Day, I don't know if you have that in Hong Kong, I delivered a script both to the Public Theatre in New York and the National Theatre in London. And it was on stage in London in April and in New York on the 11th of May. And here's a short video, part of the New York reading we did on Broadway just for one night. If you could show the video. Anticipation is always good in the theatre.
In your opening statement, you said, "We are the only global superpower with the means and moral compass capable of shaping the world for good." Mr. Tillerson, our efforts in leading the international community, for example, in sanctions against our adversaries like Iran and North Korea, represent exactly that. Leadership and a moral compass. It's not about disadvantaging American businesses. It's about putting patriotism over profit. Now, you lobbied against the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions Act. When you were the head of ExxonMobil, you wanted to eliminate secondary sanctions that would prevent joint ventures. So what message are you now going to be able to send to American business who are intent on pursuing their own interests at the expense of US policies and political stability in foreign countries?
Well, there was a lot in that question, Senator.
I'll give you the rest of my time.
Around which I could respond. First, I have never lobbied against sanctions personally. I continue to believe sanctions.
But the company that you directed did.
Well, to my knowledge, Exxon never directly lobbied against sanctions, not to my knowledge. In terms of all the other actions that were mentioned there, they were all undertaken with a great deal of transparency and openness and engagement and input in the process.
Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You said that Russia is not unpredictable. Russia does not think like we do. Can you further expand on both of those comments?
Well, in terms of their nature,
If you forgot the question, it was explain your comments that Russia is predictable, basically, and that Russia does not think like we do.
Well, in my experience, the time I've spent in Russia as an observer, my experience with the Russians are that they are very calculating, and they're very strategic in their thinking, and they develop a plan.
You have treated the world's most vulnerable communities as expendable. In our home state of Texas, people are resisting pipeline. Oil is dead. Senators, be brave. Stop this man. Protect the vulnerable.
Mr. Tillerson, now you can maybe answer the question unimpeded.
Well, Russia, more than anything, wants to reestablish its role in the global order. They believe they deserve the rightful role because they are a nuclear power. And so the steps being taken now are simply to make that point that Russia is here. I think the important conversation that we have to have with them is, does Russia want to now and forever be an adversary of the United States, or does Russia desire a different relationship?
Thank you, sir. Senator King.
Mr. Tillerson, thank you for your willingness to serve. How much information do you have about financial connections between President-elect Trump, the Trump family, or Trump organizations, and Russian individuals or organizations or the Russian government?
I have no knowledge.
And if I asked you the same question and I substituted Turkey, China, Pakistan, and Japan for Russia in that question, would your answer be the same?
I have no knowledge.
So I gather from your answer that you'll then have no way of knowing how actions proposed by a President Trump regarding those countries or others would affect his personal or family financial interests.
I have no knowledge.
How is the Congress of the American public supposed to fully judge the actions, official actions proposed by a President Trump, if we lack basic information about how those actions may benefit his personal finances?
That's a question that others will have to address, Senator.
It's quite illuminating. This was the edited excerpts of these Senate hearings. He was on stage not on stage, in the Senate. He was questioned for 5 hours, and we had to cull that down into that's a very short part of half an hour of his evidence we took. And it's very illuminating too, just in the news just last week, when he says Exxon didn't lobby, Exxon against sanctions. Exxon was fined $2 million actually last week for having lobbied against those sanctions. So he was the chief executive, yet his company had lobbied against sanctions. So it's economical with the truth, we say in England. Probably I should tell you first what formed me as a director, because as directors and theatre makers, I believe we constantly need to go back to our roots and our core beliefs. My father was a Jewish refugee from Hitler's fascist Germany. He was given political asylum in England after the Second World War in 1936. And in 1942, he met and married my mother, who was a Christian English woman. I was an only child, went to boarding school, where I struggled with my identity. Was I Jewish? Was I Christian? Was I German? Was I British? And through that experience at school, I learned to deal firsthand with racism and developed a hatred of bullying and injustice. And as a child, to escape reality, I loved going to the theatre and seeing films. It took me out of my self-absorbed, unhappy world and put me into other people's shoes. Empathy again, making me laugh, making me cry. I loved all sorts of theatre and films and wanted to work with actors and to be in that make-believe world. At the beginning of my career, that was enough. I started by working as a director on classic plays, on comedies, on farces, but hardly ever saw any new work. And then in the space of a year, I saw a film and a play and met a writer that changed everything. First, the film. The film was Zed by Costa Gavras, a wonderful, wonderful filmmaker. He's done many, many films, and I urge you to have a look out for them. Missing was one of them, which was extraordinary, about Chile. But this one was a thriller about the coming of the political dictatorship of the colonels in Greece. It was an extraordinary piece of work, incidentally with great and stirring music by Theodorakis, who at that time was a huge campaigner against the authoritarian government in Greece. And the film had great tension, but above all, it told a political and story that demanded action from its audience. I left the cinema determined to join the campaign against fascism in Greece. We demonstrated, held rallies, and we, together with thousands and thousands of others in Europe, made a difference. And Greece, the cradle of democracy, in 6 years returned back to democracy. I'm just going to show you a short excerpt of that film.
Arrêtez tout! Thomas, déclenche-moi ça!
Mais vous savez très bien que pour une réunion en lieu clos, il ne faut pas d'autorisation.
Je m'en fous! Je ne veux pas d'histoire! L'autorisation, sinon vous n'aurez pas la salle! Déclenchez-moi tout ça!
Mais non! Mais vous ne
faites ce que je vous dis! Je suis chez moi, ici. Apportez l'autorisation et je remets tout en place. Sinon, trouvez une autre salle. Toi, déclenche-moi ça!
Mais soyez raisonnable! Comment trouver une salle maintenant? Et comment prévenir 3 ou 4 000 personnes qui vont arriver de tous les quartiers de la ville?
Je ne savais pas ce que c'était comme réunion.
C'est écrit sur leur su, et vous l'avez signé.
Bon, c'est plus signé maintenant. Voilà votre chèque. Et je vous enverrai des dommages et intérêts. Je vous en prie.
Ils vous ont vraiment menacé?
Je ne comprends pas ce que vous voulez dire.
Enfin, voyons, on ne refuse pas une salle pour laquelle on a été payé sans avoir subi d'énormes pressions.
Vous autres, les avocats, vous cherchez toujours...
Monsieur Basile, c'est à la manette. Alors dites-moi qui est derrière cette histoire. Quelle est la vraie raison?
Fichez-moi la paix! Je ne veux pas vous donner ma salle, c'est une bonne raison, non? Est-ce qu'il vous plaît pas, trouvez-en une qui vous fasse plaisir.
Vous ne trouvez pas que c'est plutôt à nous de nous énerver?
Mon père est mort aujourd'hui, ça vous suffit?
For me, that's a brilliant visual representation of how the repression in Greece began. And he's a wonderful, wonderful storyteller, Kostas Gavras, and through art, he really made a difference. Have a look at that film if you get a chance. It's amazing. Then came the play. I went to the theatre and I saw a play called Are You Now or Have You Ever Been? It was about the 1950s McCarthy witch hunt against those actors and writers, mainly in Hollywood, who were thought to be communist sympathizers. It dramatized word for word the congressional hearings. Those congressional hearings caused people to go to jail, some people to betray their friends, and many, many famous actors, writers to flee from America. As a play, it was gripping, and it taught me my first lesson in how powerful verbatim theatre could be, and a great lesson for my future work it was. The third influence was a lesson in racism and injustice. Whilst working in Edinburgh at the Travis Theatre, I was befriended by a young and very talented Trinidadian writer, Mustafa Matura, now in his late 70s, who in those early days had had to struggle as a writer, along with so many black artists, to get his voice heard in British theatre, to fight to get new black plays on, and to constantly fight against racism, both in England and in the theatre. The injustice of his position in liberal Europe and his constant struggle, a decade after the civil rights movement had had some success in America, made me realize how important a tool theatre could be for change. Here's a short excerpt of a West Indian play of his I did in the early 80s that introduced me to the Tricycle Theatre, where I was director for the next 28 years, and introduced many, many people in the black community who lived around the theatre to the theatre for the first time.
I ain't saying nothing.
All this sit down, man, let me fire one. Hey, Peggy, a bottle of white table for the boys. Stanley, you're firing? No thanks, Mr. Mikey. Saturday for me.
You waking gonna have enough rum to drink, all you have to take precaution.
Oh, God, I tell you this daughter, man, she have a mouth like a stingray. Peggy, you know the boys and me have to start off on the right foot. I mean, we can't go down to a wake and everybody marry and we not. We could never catch up.
It's catching up, you catching up.
So, Mr. Stanley, when is the wedding?
Soon. These things don't happen out of the blue, you know.
No, first you've got to bait your hook, Mr. Stanley.
Yes. I don't know what you mean. Who's all this Mr. Stanley business? I thought we come here to drink.
Sorry, that's from the television production of it. It was rather difficult to see. It's videotape is getting old these days. Whilst that production was on, this short anecdote, I stood by the box office and a woman came up to me and came up to the box office and she was trying to buy some tickets and she said, "What do you mean you don't have any tickets tonight? You had tickets last night, you had tickets the night before, you had tickets the night before that. Why don't you have any tonight?" And the box office said, "We're sold out." And I went up to this woman and I said, she was a black woman and she was obviously from the Caribbean originally. And I went up to her and said, "How many nights have you seen this play?" She said, "Oh, I've seen it every single night. I come every night." And she said, "You know, they almost say the same words every night." It was her first experience of theatre, and she came to theatre very often after that, which was rather wonderful. So, in 1984, with these formative influences in mind, when I became artistic director of the Tricycle Theatre, I was able to put some of these ideas and ideals about theatre and society into action. I was in a district of London that was culturally diverse. 98 languages were spoken around our theatre. And though most of the population was white, a very large minority were Irish and African Caribbean. And my first priority was to make theatre relevant through new work and a community reality that spoke to its local audience and reflected their concerns. And so during the middle and late 1980s in Britain, we were part of a Cold War that was coming to an end with the Soviet Union. We were very much part of two hot wars, which affected the lives of many of those living round our theatre. Firstly, the apartheid system in South Africa and our government's indifference to it made every single black person living in London felt affronted by the way the Thatcher government just tolerated that apartheid government. Secondly, the fight for human rights and the bombing campaign in Northern Ireland directly affected any Irish person living in London through prejudice towards them and a denial of human rights in that region of the United Kingdom. This political reality affecting black people and Irish people around me meant that programming a theatre in this district at that time was relatively simple. I commissioned writers and did plays that spoke to the civil rights and political situation in Northern Ireland. I imported South African work that protested against apartheid, did American classic plays on the theme of civil rights and black history, and I looked for work that contrasted the economics of Thatcherism with the purer socialist principles of communism. All of this sparked a vital and interesting debate with our audience and simultaneously celebrated the multiculturalism and common concerns of those living in our borough around the theatre. Every day also we were working with white, black, Asian, Irish, Jewish, Hindu, Muslim, Christian, and even some Chinese children from the ages of 18 months up to 16 years in after-school workshops, which were geared to drama and storytelling, but were actually even more vital in allowing children to gain confidence, interact with other children of different ethnicities and backgrounds. And thus the dynamic of the whole theatre I was running was towards empathizing with and celebrating our differences as audiences, as well as enjoying their similarities. A decade later, everything changed. In the early 1990s, the Berlin Wall came down and communism in the Soviet Union collapsed. The Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland was concluded, and the peace process was well underway. Nelson Mandela had been released from prison, and democratic elections had at long last been held in South Africa. I suddenly found myself running a theatre with an audience that expected us to be involved in politics, but with no vision myself as to how I could deliver such a program. The answer came from an unexpected quarter. The British government in 1993 was holding a public inquiry into the fact that despite it being against the law and their denying it, they had been selling arms to Iraq, to Saddam Hussein, for the past 10 years, and he had used those arms for his war against Iran, but also against his own people. Every Sunday I played tennis with a journalist who covered this inquiry, which had been going on for 18 months and was not covered by television, and certainly only short occasional articles about it were put in the press. During our Sunday games, he used to give us a running commentary on what had happened the previous week. One Sunday after tennis and his update on the inquiry, I went home, read the Sunday newspapers, only to find that two of the most important newspapers stressed in their editorials that this inquiry could provide one of the most important British constitutional documents of the second half of the 20th century, and an incomplete view of how we were being governed constitutionally. Yet apart from the Sunday tennis anecdotes, I knew very little about the issues concerned. Here was an inquiry that had been going on for months, which was very complex, which involved the Prime Minister and many senior members of government. And yet, although being held in the public in a tiny room, it was not televised and it was only occasionally reported in the press. I suddenly thought, why not do this on stage so people could get an overview of the issues and the debate around it? I would learn more, and more importantly, so would my audience. The staff in the theatre box office of my theatre thought I was completely nuts and told me it'd be a great time for them to take their holidays, as only one man and a dog would ever come and see this show. And even the actors were very uncertain whether it would work. The journalist with whom I was working had to turn an inquiry with hearings involving about 60 people and running for 18 months into a play lasting 2 hours with about 12 characters, which was about all we could afford, both in time and money. There are about 10 scenes in the finished play, and we rehearsed each one separately. And after 2 weeks, one day, we put the whole thing together and brought all the actors together. And suddenly there was huge excitement in the room, and we all realized we had something very special. It told a story, it opened up a debate, was funny and compelling, and probably would make people very angry at government hypocrisy. Within 48 hours of opening the play, we'd sold out the 5-week run completely. The audience loved it, the critics loved it, and they called it a tribunal play, and that was the first of many. Most importantly, though, I realized that single-issue politics was what an audience wanted, and what theatre could do well, and what people were hungry to see. The end of the Cold War in the 1990s had seen the flourishing of organizations like Amnesty International, Greenpeace, War on Want, Médecins Sans Frontières. People were getting more and more involved in campaigning. Globalization made single issues more important and effective. And what better way to inform people and galvanize them into action than the theatre? So our next project came in 1996 on the 50th anniversary of the Nuremberg Nazi War Crimes Tribunal after the Second World War. It came with the realization we could reconstruct the hearings and couple them with short plays about the genocides much more recently in Rwanda, Bosnia, and Haiti, and be part of a campaign which led up to the setting up of an international criminal court where world leaders could be prosecuted for war crimes. In 1996, it was completely unthinkable that such a court could come into being. Yet only 4 years later, under the Treaty of Rome it had happened, a momentous event, though notably a few countries have yet to sign the treaty, including America. We opened the evening with a speech by Judge Richard Goldstone, who was at that time chief prosecutor of the one international court that did exist for criminal activities, the court for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. This Goldstone speech openly campaigned for the setting up of an international criminal court, which was not confined just to those genocidal crimes committed in ex-Yugoslavia and Rwanda, but would have worldwide jurisdiction. It powerfully reinforced our reasons for doing the Nuremberg play at this 50th anniversary. And Lord Shawcross's speech in our reconstruction of that 1946 trial most eloquently makes the case for a future court to prevent such genocides ever happening again. So I'm now going to show not Goldstone's 1996 brilliant speech, but the British lead prosecutor, Lord Shawcross' speech, closing speech from the 1946 Nuremberg war crimes trials.
I will now call upon the Chief Prosecutor for the United Kingdom of Great Britain.
That these defendants participated in and are morally guilty of crimes so frightful that the imagination staggers and reels back at their very contemplation is not in doubt. In their graves, crying out not for vengeance, but that this shall not happen again, 10 million who might be living in peace and happiness at this hour. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, and civilians killed in battles that ought never to have been. Nor was that the only or the greatest crime. 2/3 of the Jews in Europe exterminated, more than 6 million of them on the killer's own figures. Not in battle, not in passion, but in the cold, calculated, deliberate attempt to destroy nations and races, to disintegrate the traditions, the institutions, and the very existence of free and ancient states. For such crimes, these men might well have been proceeded against by summary executive action, and had the treatment which they had been parties to meting out to so many millions of innocent people been meted out to them, they could hardly have complained. But this tribunal is to adjudge their guilt not on any moral or ethical basis alone, but according to law. Let them now, accused, murderers as they are, attempt to belittle the power and influence they exercised how they will. We have only to recall their ranting as they strutted across the stage of Europe, dressed in their brief authority, to see the part they played. They did not then tell the German people or the world that they were merely the ignorant, powerless puppets of their Führer. The defendant Speer has said, even in a totalitarian system, there must be total responsibility. It is impossible, after the catastrophe, to evade this total responsibility. If the war had been won, the leaders would also have assumed total responsibility. Almost immediately after the war had started, the organized extermination of the Jewish race began. Hearst describes the improvements that he made at Auschwitz. He introduced the new gas, Zyklon B, which took from 3 to 15 minutes to kill the people in the death chamber, dependent on climatic conditions. We knew the people were dead because their screaming stopped. Let the engineer Graeber speak of the massacre at Dubno. On the 5th of October 1942, my foreman told me that Jews from Dubno had been shot in 3 large pits, each about 30 meters long and 3 meters deep. About 1,500 persons had been killed daily. All of the 5,000 Jews who had been living in Dubno before the pogrom were to be liquidated. I drove to the site and went directly to the pits. The people who had got off the trucks, men, women, and children of all ages, had to undress upon the orders of an SS man who carried a riding or dog whip. They had to put down their clothes in fixed places, sorted, according to shoes, top clothing, and underclothing. I saw a heap of shoes of about 800 to 1,000 pairs, great piles of underlinen and clothing. Without screaming or weeping, these people undressed, stood around in family groups, kissed each other, said farewells, and waited for a sign from another SS man, who stood near the pit, also with a whip in his hand. During the 15 minutes that I stood near, I heard no complaint or plea for mercy. I watched a family of about 8 persons, a man and a woman both about 50, with their children of about 1, 8, and 10, and 2 grown-up daughters of about 20 to 24. An old woman with snow-white hair was holding the 1-year-old child in her arms and singing to it and tickling it. The child was cooing with delight. The couple were looking on with tears in their eyes. The father was holding the hand of a boy about 10 years old and speaking to him softly. The boy was fighting his tears. The father pointed to the sky, stroked his head, and seemed to explain something to him. At that moment, the SS man at the pit shouted something to his comrade. The latter counted off about 20 persons and instructed them to go behind the earth mound. Among them was the family which I have mentioned. I well remember a girl, slim and with black hair, who, as she passed close to me, pointed to herself and said, 23. I walked around the mound and found myself confronted by a tremendous grave. People were closely wedged together and lying on top of each other, so that only their heads were visible. Nearly all had blood running over their shoulders from their heads. Some of the people shot were still moving. Some were lifting their arms and turning their heads to show that they were still alive. The pit was already 2/3 full. I estimated that it already contained about 1,000 people. I looked for the man who did the shooting. He was an SS man who sat at the edge of the narrow end of the pit, his feet dangling into the pit. He had a Tommy gun on his knees and was smoking a cigarette. The people, completely naked, went down some steps which were cut in the clay wall of the pit and clambered over the heads of the people lying there to the place to which the SS man directed them. They lay down in front of the dead or injured people. Some caressed those who were still alive and spoke to them in a low voice. Then I heard a series of shots. I looked into the pit and saw that the bodies were twitching, or their heads lying motionless on top of the bodies which lay before them. Blood was running away from their necks. I was surprised I was not ordered away.
Very distressing speech. I'm not saying in any way that our production of Nuremberg or the plays about Rwanda, ex-Yugoslavia, caused the Treaty of Rome, the setting up of the International Court, Criminal Court. But what I am saying is that theatre can capture a zeitgeist, a moment of opportunity, and start or reinforce a debate which opens people's minds up to the possibilities and gives them aspirations for change. And I think that production very, very slightly did that towards the criminal court, the International Criminal Court. Political theatre allows people to question everyday reality, to dream of a better future. Much of the work that started in a small 250-seat theatre in northwest London, the Tricycle, has been presented in over 30 theatres in the UK, has played in the London's West End and off Broadway in the United States, in over 25 American cities and in translation in Spain and Italy. And all of it has gone on to be published and much of it to be seen or heard on the BBC World Service, on BBC Radio, on television. And altogether we've reached an audience of over 22 million people with these documentary plays. So there all the possibilities for you as a younger generation are there to take and make your voice heard. So from this, you'll not be surprised to hear that I'm a great believer in the theory that a butterfly can flap its wings in Hong Kong or Tokyo, and a few hours later, the tiny disturbance of air around it has caused a storm in Beijing, New Delhi, London or New York. Verbatim theatre can be such a butterfly. It's made like a caterpillar, growing slowly with many legs of plodding research, and sometimes it never even emerges from the chrysalis to become a butterfly. But when it does and comes into the light, it can be beautiful, inspiring, and even if it sometimes captures only the immediate mood, it doesn't matter. Its flight at times seems somewhat aimless, but it's a miracle that defies an audience not to think about it. You may question its purpose, but at best, it enhances your life, and it has a truth and a beauty all of its own. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Kent. And well, it really makes me understand more why I was so moved whenever I visit classical theatre. And now I think I hand the following time to Mr. Kroesinger to talk about his thought on the relationship between theatre and society.
Well, while listening to Nick, I have to assume I'm moved, and I will change my speech in my head a little bit, because I would like to try to respond. In this last example you showed us, you confronted us with his speech, and I think it shows us a lot about the ability of the theatre to give us a chance to encounter things we don't want to be encountered with. Just if you have the details, the blood running down over the shoulders, the SS man sitting down smoking a cigarette, the people standing there having no complaints, and it creates a moment, and it creates a moment which you will not forget it, because it tells you something about the possibilities of man, the possibilities of human beings, in a good way and in a bad way. And I think when we talk about the theatre, or when we talk about the documentary theatre, our works have a lot in common, because I think what it is all about is when we talk about responsibility, it's already in the word. We have to respond. There is something happening, and the theatre is a great place where we can do that, where we can respond to the things which are going on around us. I was listening to the first debate we had in the morning, and there was this moment when there was a little talk about Carol made this notice about the Peter Weiss play, the investigation, and I'm sure you all know what the investigation is. It's a play about the Auschwitz trial, and he is constructing the play just from the things which were said in the trial. And I had the opportunity in the 80s. I was working in the Freie Volksbühne, and in the Volksbühne the first performance of this play took place, and it was in 1965. And this play opened not only in the theater in West Berlin, it also was performed the same evening in East Berlin. It opened on the same night in 19 different theaters in Germany. The investigation, and I spoke with a person who was working there since a very long time. He was working in the sound department, and he told me that he has a tape of the opening night, the first night, and if I would like to listen to the tape. And what was a special thing about this tape was that usually in our days when you take the sound of the performance, you try to put the mic as close to the actors as that you don't have the noise of the audience. But in these days they made a very strange decision. They put up the mics in the audience. And in 1965, 1966, you could hear that the West German society was not very pleased with this kind of play. Because what these people talk about, they talk about the killings. They talk about how they took part in the killings. They talk about their mission. They talk about their tasks. And you could hear, for me, because I'm from another generation, it was difficult a little bit somehow to deal with the strategies of the actors, because the actors put in a lot of emotion in the text. And the text is very powerful in itself. But what you could experience, that the actors had to struggle with an audience which would not like to listen to what they were saying. And so you could hear the pauses, and you could hear, in Germany there is a saying, you can hear a needle fall when there is silence. And in listening to this tape of this performance, there were a lot of moments where you could hear the needle fall. Because Peter Weiss was communicating something which had a lot to do with the society, this Western society, West German society of 1966, 1965. Because of course after the war, no one was eager to tell about what was happening in the times of National Socialism. And from my belief, there would have not been the Auschwitz trial if there would have not been the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem. Because the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem forced the German government to put on something like this in Germany. This, from my opinion, was the reason for the Auschwitz trial in Germany, which took place in Frankfurt. And but I don't want to go too much in detail about that. When Nick was showing his favorites, he was also showing this short excerpt from Z, from Costa Gavras. And that's a film which had a deep impact on me too, because Z is showing you something in what is happening in a state in the preparation of a coup. And it's an experience you make in the cinema. You can't take a distance to this experience. It shows you how there is a setup, how there is a planning, which strategies there are. Because most of the time when something terrible happens, people say, well, we did not know, you could not see, and something like this is never happening out of the blue. There is always preparation. And as a citizen and as an artist, I think we have the responsibility to be very aware of what is going on around us. Our task is to pay attention what is going on. And I think there is no better place than the theater where you can think about a society, where you can think about yourself in this society, where you can think about what is going on around you. And you try to communicate that. You try to give it a form. You try to give it an artistic form. You try to find a form for it that other people can work with it, that people can take something out of it. And in the film there is this, one of the actors says there must be a reason. There's always a reason. There's always a reason, there's always an interest. And I think we have to be very careful about these interests, about these reasons. And this is giving us a chance to, it gives us material to work with. It gives us material we can describe, and it gives us material which we can work on. And another thing, it's really funny. When I get lost, you tell me. I just try to think up in the open. It's you saw this play about the McCarthy hearings, and in 1997 I did a play at the Berliner Ensemble about the hearing of Hans Eisler. Because Hans Eisler is a German composer, and he was living in the United States, and of course he was a communist, and he was in front of the McCarthy Committee, and Brecht was also in front of the McCarthy Committee. And well, we are all human beings, and Brecht didn't behave like a hero, what we maybe have thought he would behave like one. But Eisler, he was really brave, he was very powerful. He was very strong in what he said. He was very open. And he was questioning the, he was questioning the power of the committee in a democratic society, because the USA calls itself a democratic society, if it has the power to ask these kind of questions. And so he is giving, in the hearing, he is giving the judges a lesson about what are democratic rules. And it's one of the most amazing documents I know, where you can find a person standing in front of a committee and making sense of the situation. It's very powerful. And what is really sad about this, that Eisler was he was so brave, and he was so open, and has artistic freedom, and he was going to take all these risks in this committee. And later on, in 1953, when he was living in the Eastern Republic, the Democratic Republic of Germany, in Eastern Germany, he wanted to do a play about Faust. He wanted to compose an opera about Dr. Faustus. But what he didn't take advantage of was that he wanted to do a very critical image of Dr. Faustus. Faust is the German hero. Faust is the most, everybody in Germany, every school kid has to read Faust, and Faust, you have to deal with Faust. You can't get away from Faust. And it's a very good play. I don't say anything about Faust, because Faust, especially Faust II, is a very strong play. But what is interesting about Faust is that Eisler made a terrible mistake, because Ulbricht, who was running the GDR at this time, he said, well, we have to make a point against West Germany. And in our national belief, Faust is the East German hero. Without that East Germany was existing, but we have to say that Faust is part of because Weimar is in East Germany, so Faust, Goethe, that's the guy who is speaking for the right opinions. And what is so terribly sad when you see this thing, what Eisler wanted to write, he wants to write this opera, there is this thing which is called the Academy of Arts. And in the Academy of Arts, he is sitting there together with his colleagues. He's sitting together with famous composers, writers, filmmakers, and they discuss. And he thinks they all have the same political opinion. They have the same belief in this communist idea. But what do you do when the head of the state says that Faust is a good guy, and you want to compose something that Faust is not a good guy? And in these 3 meetings, which he has, where he is discussing his plan, they talk him out of it. They put so much pressure on him that the only thing what he has written from this opera is a sketch, the outline of the opera, and there is a few songs that are existing, and there is a few scenes. But he never composed the opera. He drank for a year. He did not compose at all to recover from this experience. So this, I was reminded of this when you were talking about the McCarthy thing. And of course, there is another thing we have in common, I think. Most of the works I don't do alone. I do it together with my wife, Regina. She's a documentary filmmaker, and we develop it together right from the beginning. And you were saying you were doing something about the Rwandan genocide, when it was taking place. And I was on tour with a play in Canada, and I was on tour. You sit in hotel rooms and you watch television, and sometimes you see things which are interesting and sometimes you don't. And I saw an interview with a Canadian general. We were in Calgary, Romeo Dallaire. And he said, well, when the killing was going on in Rwanda in 1996, it would have been easy for the world to stop it. But nobody was interested, because everybody was paying attention to Yugoslavia. And I don't know if you know this feeling that you get a punch out of the television set. Because that's exactly what it was. We had done a play about the war in Yugoslavia. Because of course it was in Europe. Genocide was happening in Europe again. And of course everybody was paying attention to this. And the people who planned the genocide in Rwanda, they knew that it was the exact time to do it at this moment. Because the whole world was obsessed with Yugoslavia, with Europe. And it was not, it was not nice to do genocide again in Europe. So it could happen in Rwanda. And then we developed a play about that. We developed a play about the genocide in Rwanda, and we were very astonished to find out that we had, that part of the history of Rwanda has to do with German history. So we linked it to the German history, and we developed a play out of that, which we performed a lot of times, because a lot of people in Germany didn't know that there is a connection between the history of Rwanda and the history of Germany. And we have another thing in common. We have, you were doing the anti-apartheid things. When the wall came down in 1989, in Germany there was a committee was founded, the Joachim Gauck Committee, and it was dealing with what was happening in the eastern part of Germany. And at the same time, in 1994, there was in South Africa the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They were also dealing with the history. So Regina and I decided that we would go to South Africa because we were interested in how they are dealing with this part of history. So we went to South Africa and we took part in the CCB hearing. Probably you don't know what the CCB hearing is. I didn't know this before. The CCB hearing was, a Civil Cooperation Bureau. And the Civil Cooperation Bureau was a hit squad of the South African Defense Forces. And we took part in the hearing for 1 week, and it was a space which is a third of the size of this space. And in the hearing you had the people who were murderers. One guy, Fadi Bernard, he was there, he was convicted. I will never understand this English system of law. He was convicted to 327 years in prison because of killing for 47 people. And he was applying for amnesty because he was trying to prove that he was not doing killings out of, bad motives. He was killing for the state. He was fighting the enemy of the state. And so what he was trying to explain was that it was all legal, what he was doing. And there was a charge against him, and there was a charge against Joe Verster. Verster was running the CCB bureau. he was a guy who was in charge. And it's very strange when you sit in a space where he was giving the orders how you deal with the ANC. And he gave the orders to send a bomb in a letter to a priest who was an anti-apartheid activist. And the guy survived, it just blew his head off. No, not his head, his hands. And you have the priest sitting there 5 meters away from him, and he has no hands, he has steel claws. And he is explaining why it was necessary to give this order to send this bomb to this guy, because he was dangerous to the state at this moment. And whenever he was talking about the ANC, he was not talking about the government, because the ANC was a government at this time. He was talking about the former enemy of the state who is in charge now. He saw himself as as a victim of history. And in his beliefs, he was right. Everything he was doing, he was right. And of course, we all know how history is. He got granted amnesty. And because he was a very clever man, I think he still is, he must be still alive, he was not so old at this time. He started a company, a security company. And people working for him were former people from the South African Defense Forces who were fighting against apartheid, against the ANC. And now they have very good positions in a structure which is defending the public. And because he's a very clever guy, he even took 15% of former ANC fighters, and now they are working in his company. And we met a guy who was fighting for the armed wing of the ANC, and his task was, he was responsible for killings too and for attacks. And his task was to deal with the perpetrators. And the ANC had a very strict law how they would deal with perpetrators. They would kill them. And they would kill them in the community. They would put, what's the English word for this?
Necklace.
They would put a necklace around him, a rubber. They would put gas in it, and they would burn it. And so everybody in the township would know that this guy is a collaborator, he's a perpetrator. And he said he was tricked by the CCP 2 times. So he gave orders to kill a person who was innocent. And he's still living in this township. And of course, you can imagine what was happening to the family of this man who was killed. And he says, I'm responsible for this. I have to live with this kind of guilt. I have to go on. And I meet these people, these family members almost every day. And we have to find a way how we get along in building up this new society, this new democratic society, which we try to build up in South Africa now. The other thing we found out was really an eye-opening experience to go to South Africa and listen to this hearing. We met a lawyer, George Bezos, who was defending the Mandela in the times, and now he was one of the prosecutors in the ANC, in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And he told us that the reason for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was that the ANC had to make a deal with the government forces when they came to power. When they came to power in a legal and democratic way, was the only way to avoid a civil war. And so they set up the structure of this Truth and Reconciliation Commission that the state would guarantee that there will be a legal election. But somehow the ANC must guarantee that there is a chance for people who were responsible for the former government to get out without prosecution. And so you see, politics, it's about deals, it's about aims, it's about things you want to achieve. And we learned a lot in this hearing. We constructed a play out of this. And of course, as you can imagine, a lot of these experiences you make when you do this kind of research, it's unpleasant experience. But you have to do it, because it tells you something about the possibilities we all have in special situations, in societies we live in circumstances we have to deal with. And that every time when we do something, we decide for something or we decide against something. So in this type of theater I'm doing together with Regina is the sentence, I have no knowledge, or I don't know. It's not an appropriate sentence for the 21st century, because the information is all around. And the theater is a very good place to deal with this kind of information, because in this space together with the living actor and the living audience, it's a live situation. And we can share this experience, and we can communicate. We can communicate, and we have to communicate about things we are concerned with. Well, I hope you don't get lost. So, if you have questions.
Yes, thanks very much. Thank you very much. Well, I can listen to their stories all the day, and I find all the experience are very inspiring. But sadly, time is running short. So I think we can accommodate one or two questions. 我諗可以有一兩個問題去問嘅，但係因為真係時間唔多，有冇朋友想問問題 ？Is there any questions? As I said, you can ask in Cantonese or Mandarin, and I try my best to translate. 即係你可以大家可以係啦，用廣東話問或者有冇朋友有問題？嗰邊有朋友。
Hi. I would like to ask, the two directors about how you strike a balance between subjectivity and objectivity when you produce your play. Because those are historical events. But anyway, you want just to present it, in an objective way, or you want to add your own, elements or opinions to be heard by the audience. So how to strike a balance between this?
There is no such thing as objectivity in the documentary theater, because everybody who is doing research knows. You find out much more things than you can put in the play. And every decision you take for this kind of material is a decision against other material. So what you can try to achieve is that you try to create a field. And you create a field with as much contradicting informations, materials, which is possible. And you have to deal with this, you have to survive with this. So Regina is very good in this. When you make up it's like creating a landscape, and it's a landscape where you're trying to get lost, and you have dead-end streets, but you have to go in these streets. You have to do this. You have to force the audience in a situation where they take a stand, where they decide. And of course, when I have always, for example, we use material of this Freddy Bernard when he was explaining why he was doing the killing. And what to me was interesting and eye-opening that he saw himself as a victim of history. Because at this time when he saw himself as a soldier, these guys were terrorists. And he was fighting the terrorists. And he had no idea that there could be a change in the system. It was not in his structure. And it was interesting, and it was much more frightening for the audience if you take this stand as a real stand. Of course, we later found out that he also got a bonus of $10,000 for each killing, which made him see more ANC dangerous people around than probably there were. But of course, when you work with the actor, then you tell the actor, don't judge this person. Deliver the lines and take him serious. Because this is creating the struggle for the audience. Because it's much more, it's much more challenging for you as an audience member if you have to confront this. People always say that the Nazi people, they had no moral system. This is totally nonsense. They had a moral system, but the moral system was very different from our moral system. And this makes it much more dangerous. You have to think, you have to confront other people's belief, and you have to point them as strongly as possible. It doesn't mean that you have to agree with them, but you have to show them.
I totally agree with that. I think that's completely right. I think where most of the subjectivity comes in, though, is the choice of subject. Because when you've chosen to do something, I then always, and I have a feeling Hans does too, from what he's just said, try and get a balance of both views, and so that the audience, in the way, is the judge. The fact you've chosen the subject is the important thing. You're obviously agitating about that subject and wanting the public to know and have a debate about it. Then you must create a balance. You must show as much conflict as possible so that it's interesting for an audience to watch. But what's very important, in my view, is not to be agitprop theatre, where you're only putting one side, because that just pisses the audience off, and it's not right. It's not documentary, that. What we're doing, I think, is trying to get as near as possible to a purer form of the truth by trying not to be biased, but knowing that we are going to be, having chosen that subject.
Yeah, thank you very much. And well, I'm sorry, I really want to hear more and have more conversation, but yes, it's really time for us to end this session. Yes, and thank you very much for the two speakers for the great experience. And so the session in the afternoon is starting at 2:30. So please come back for the next two sessions. Thank you very much.